Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer and poet Brian Bilston, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry. Has released or published a lot of books already, poetry, novels, toured a lot, currently with Henry Normal, and has collaborated with the Catenary Wires on a new album, which also will include live dates, which are going to be coming out this October onwards for the merry month of November. I will put a link to his website in the notes below, but so you'll find more information about Brian. But let's get down to the fascinating interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Brian, it's over to you.
Well, I did. It probably wasn't really until my teenage years, but up until that point, anyway, I'd always been into music as long as I could remember, and I come from a family that loves its music. My dad, for instance, has been in a band or various bands since about 1963, and is still gigging today. And so there was always music on in the house. He was a big fan of Cliff and the Shadows and the Beatles and Elvis and, country and western and all sorts of different things. So there was always records playing in the house. We grew up watching, Top the Pops every week. And then I've got a big brother as well, who's a couple of years older than me. And so he started getting into music I was finding a bit more relevant and interesting than my dad's music, or at least how I thought about my dad's music at that time. And my brother was a mod. He got into the Jam, who I then also loved because I just loved all the music that my brother would play. And he got into the Kinks and the Small Faces and the Who. So I kind of... So that was, I felt like I kind of inherited all of that from the people around me. Whereas actually my own first few forays into the world of music were things like buying, I think the first single I ever bought, maybe not the coolest single in the world, but it was Kevin Keegan.
Classic.
With his classic hits, Head Over Heels in Love. And I remember it having... The title of the song was going. Was the typography was going around his sort of late 70s bubble perm.
Beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. I was. Did he ever do a duet with, some sort of duet with Glenn Hoddle at one stage? I can't remember. If that
was. If we're on the subject of novelty footballer records, that was more like mid-80s. That was Hoddle and Waddle. That was Glenn Hoddle and Chris Waddle.
Right, yeah. By then I'd slightly... Because I know every of those teams, like when Scotland were going into the World Cup in 74 and 78, they went out and performed one of the most atrocious songs of all time. And with great kind of enthusiasm, which obviously didn't bode well when they thought they were going to come back with the World Cup, but lost badly. And
it used to be a real thing, those kind of national football songs, and they were uniformly awful, weren't they, until New Order really surprised everybody.
Yes, I think New Order pulled that one together, and there was a sort of an element of that, and it's kind of it was strange how that sort of all happened actually. But Kevin Keegan, and he was, during that period, I do remember he was everywhere, and that's why I think if you ever asked anybody what their favourite number was, it was always number 7 because it was Keegan and Barry Sheen. Anybody grown up during the 70s, the 7 is quite sort of imprinted, and there was also a strange program, not strange, but there was the Superstars, where you got sporting people from different disciplines doing all these bits. And Kevin, he was like this little action man with rather enthusiastic hair because he came off his bike and badly hurt himself. But being such a little trooper, he got back up and kept going. And You know, you couldn't beat him. But then we also then had David Soul, which I remember being a bit, you know, emotionally confused because at that stage he was in Starsky and Hutch, and then suddenly he was on Top of the Pops talking about love, and it's like, God, what's going on? I couldn't relate to that. That could be the same character. Acting, you know, I thought you were that bit like Alan Partridge, really. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I guess it's always happened though, hasn't it? And I mean, particularly between acting and singing. And you're talking about Bowie earlier, of course, who bridged the two, and before him, there's plenty. Tommy Steele. Go back to the '50s, and they're all up to it. So
Yeah, and
uh,
Cliff, well, absolutely Cliff as well. I
yeah,
mean, he was an absolute super trooper. And I suppose, in a weird way, the Monkey and the Beatles. So,
Mhm.
God, where would do it? So, yeah. So, did you grow up in Birmingham? Was this your hometown?
Yeah, that's right. South Birmingham, and I was there till the age of 18, and most of my family are still there or nearby. Um, and so, yeah, I kind of grew up in this house where the radio was always on, or the record player was always on, or my dad was always heading out to gigs, and
Was he a
he
guitarist?
played guitar and would also sing. And back in the '60s, he had his band had a record contract with Polydor. They released a couple of singles, but the timing and various other things never quite worked out for them. And
What was the band called?
they were called the UK Bonds. And they had a couple of singles out in the I think it was in '66. They didn't chart, and so by the time I was sort of conscious of what my dad was doing, he was doing more like kind of functions. He was playing weddings and so forth, and doing covers. But he'd had that in his past, which I'd always. It's kind of funny when you're a teenager and your dad goes on stage and does covers of the songs in the charts. It's just like the most embarrassing thing ever. But now I look back at it. Indeed, I still look at him now gigging away, doing covers and doing them brilliantly, and I'm just immensely kind of proud of him and the thousands of hours of enjoyment is given to other people, whether they
Yes,
liked it or
yes.
not. Yeah.
But then I suppose he comes from that same stock of performers. A bit like, is it the Searchers who are going to be at Glastonbury Festival in 2 or 3 weeks' time with their last ever show? But I think they've been doing that gig now since probably the very early '60s, and they're still there. And that and obviously people like the Rolling Stones are still somehow doing something somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that generation, it's a bit like, you don't want to get too much of a sweeping statement, but some performers go, oh, I feel a bit of I don't know. You don't want to get into it. A few people have a few dates, a few live, have a few years in showbiz, and then they have to, I don't know, go and have some existential problem. Whereas people like Lemmy just took more speed than Jack Daniels and got back on the road and kept on rocking. And I think there was a sort of generation. I used to love how Lemmy just looked at his career, was just like, I haven't, that's it. That's all I can do. And like a plumber or electrician, you're not always going to enjoy it, but that's your job. And you go on the road, you do it, you write the album, you go back on the road, you do it. What else is he going to do? And it was amazing. It was just amazing. So it was kind of good. And I remember Lawrence from Felt, who then became part of Denim in the very early '90s. He wrote a very amazing song, which is still one of the great songs of all time, called "The Osmonds," and it describes about that Birmingham bombing, doesn't it? And that kind of impact the bombing had in sort of Birmingham at that time, and that before social media, you just it describes this kind of experience and how news of it came out. Were you aware of that kind of period and that incident?
No, not really. I mean, it was by the time I was sort of conscious of it, it was a few years. It was a few years on, and it was it was something that would be referred back to. But I do sort of remember growing up though in this atmosphere in Birmingham where it often didn't feel particularly safe to kind of go out, and actually I'm not talking just about the IRA here at all, but just it was quite a scary, tough place for me as a teenager, and so as a consequence, I didn't end up going to see many bands in my kind of teenage years, because often whenever I go out, I'd have like a bad experience. You end up kind of being mugged or being chased through the streets, and just simply for being there. And yeah, it's kind of funny that although I was really into my music as a teenager, I didn't end up seeing many bands at all during those sort of early years, because it was far safer just to stay at home and listen to them in my bedroom.
Yes, well, absolutely. So after the Kevin Keegan single, what was the follow-up and the first album you bought?
Well, so my brother got into the Jam, and then I ended up buying one of the Jam albums, Sound Effects, I think it was.
Right.
And then I was listening to a lot of stuff in the charts at the time, and things like Specials and Squeeze and Orange Juice, and then I heard this other kind of sounds coming out of my brother's bedroom, and he got a cassette tape. I think he recorded it from a friend of the first Smiths album, and I think I'd just seen the Smiths. I can't remember what order this had happened. Whether I heard the album first or I saw the Smiths on the tube.
Yes.
The first time they were on the telly, and I guess I would have been about 13, and that completely changed things for me, really. And to the degree that I remember sort of borrowing my brother's cassette tape, and probably when he wasn't there in the first place, and then I just played it and played it to the degree that he ended up vaguely hating the Smiths because his younger brother just kind of played them all the time, and I became quite obsessed with them, and was the sort of person who'd kind of bunk off school when a new single came out in order to kind of
Yes.
get the next record from them.
Well, it was quite a formative moment. I still sort of, look at music in slight chapters, really, and sort of in a simplistic way of that punk and post-punk, and I know there were, there was goth and electro and new romantic, and then 83 the Smiths appeared, and then 5 years there was this kind of chapter in the 80s, and everything else sort of came around the Smiths. I mean, you had bands like Echo and the Bunnymen and Tears for Julian Cope and people like that, and even U2, who frankly were never going to make it big. But then the Smiths came, and that 5 years was just like everything else was like the June Brides, the Mighty Lemon Drops, the Primitives, they were all there, but they were sort of underneath this majestic band who were just perfection in every way possible, and lyrics that you kind of just could recite back and get excited by and dance embarrassingly on your own in front of nobody. It was just a freedom, wasn't it? For me anyway. So
yeah, no, exactly. And I think the back in the 80s, where you were growing up with with that sort of in Thatcher's Britain, and you're in a big city, and it's miserable, it's scary outside, and you're a teenager and you feel quite isolated. There was so much to get hold of there with the Smiths, and
yes.
And that both kind of lyrically, but also the kind of the guitars, whether they were joyous or haunting, there was something there. So I became quite obsessed. I had the obligatory quiff and cardigan and Smith's t-shirts and ill-fitting jeans, all of that business. And they were the first band that I could call mine in some ways. Even though I'd kind of first heard them through my brother, I quickly adopted them as mine.
Yes.
And there weren't many people at my school who kind of liked them or really were into what I regard as more interesting, articulate kind of music. So it was quite a while before I was aware of that sort of, I don't want to call it an underbelly, but all those other indie bands that were still operating kind of simultaneously to the Smiths. So it wasn't really until I was about 18 or so that I I started to play kind of catch up where I can, or indeed discovered, I guess, those more obscure bands that were knocking around but were still inexplicably not famous because they were so brilliant.
Yes, well, I know it was incredible. There was all those, and there were lots of bands I loved. Like the Chills and the Triffids and the Go-Betweens. But there was lots of bands that I slightly missed, which was embarrassing, like the Comsat Angels and the Chameleons and the Sound. And you think, oh my God, this is, it's like it's a confessional podcast. But afterwards, but you sort of look back. But again, unless one had lots of cash, it was, you couldn't just kind of stream it and listen to it. And it was just, and also there was almost, for me, the Smiths filled in that indie pop thing. And then there was interest in bands like the Bundu Boys or Gregory Isaac or Bulgarian folk music. Basically, John Peel was my other beacon of kind of cultural references. There was people like Ivor Cutler who came into my life at that stage. And then, he had those Welsh bands like Daft Bluggy and, and again, it was just like, God, Peel was just his education. But there was Public Enemy came along and then a guy called Gerald and then Detroit house music. And it was like every night was just this. So the Smiths was like, it was almost like I've got the indie pop and a few other bits. I don't need a whole, shelf full of them. I do, but there was other ones like Dead Can Dance and the 4AD label coming out, which was also quite intriguing. So I think there was that.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'd listened to Peel quite a lot in those days. And I think for me though, what I'd often listen to or listen out for was were the words, were the lyrics. And so as soon as I found somebody with a sort of articulate, writing articulate songs, then I'd quickly kind of get myself familiar with them and end up buying a lot of their stuff. So actually, back in those earlier days too, it was people like Lloyd Cole and the Commotions, Prefab Sprout, Aztec Camera, that first Aztec Camera album. These are all bands that had some level of chart success, but I kind of saw them in this great space between sort of pop and indie, between commercialism and poetry, and all that space was a real kind of sweet spot for me, I think, at the time.
Yes, well, Lloyd Cole especially was fantastic. And did that then lead you into sort of, watching those kitchen sink dramas of the late 50s and 60s, like A Taste of Honey and Saturday Night, Sunday Morning, A Kind of Loving? Did that, in Elizabeth Smart's famous book about I Sat Down at Central Station, did you then start thinking, I must go back and watch these and hear these lines?
Well, yeah, absolutely, because that's the thing. Once you got into the Smiths, then you ended up, if you really got into them, you ended up being part of that entire, wanting to kind of find out about that entire universe. So yeah, I watched a lot of those films. I read all those books, kind of loving, and all the Alan Sillitoe and Sheila Delaney kind of stuff, and I was a big fan of Coronation Street back then as well, and that sort of all of those kitchen sink kind of reference points. Again, they kind of resonated with me too. I mean, I wasn't really from like a working class background as such, but we weren't quite middle class either. But I recognised in them, that the people want to try to get ahead and kind of find some way out of the situation they found themselves in. For me, it was find my way out of Birmingham and then figure out what I wanted to kind of do in life. And I ended up kind of going off to university at 18, and that was an unknown thing because nobody in my family had ever been off to uni before. We didn't quite know what was involved. And for me it was just 3 years of avoiding having to make any other decisions about what I might do in life.
Yes, well, you get a grant and you didn't have to. And sometimes I think during some of those periods, I think the 70s and possibly the 80s, you could even claim housing benefit. And during the summer, winter periods, you could still sign on and bits and pieces. I remember my brother, couldn't even be bothered because, the grant covered all those expenses, so you never left university with any debt unless you really did go out of your way to spend lots of money. But it was kind of a nice 3 years. And also during the 80s, I mean, there was the yuppie, but there was also, for me, that was the other thing why my other little theory about why there's so many indie bands was that there was such a massive amount of unemployment that a lot of people didn't go to sixth form and didn't go to university and were just on the dole. And we'd had the Falkland War, and then we had the miners' strike, and then the whole Greenham Commons. So it was like the yuppies looked like having a great time, but everyone else was just signing on. But then you had the enterprise allowance schemes and those kind of job seekers allowance bits and pieces. So it gave people a chance to sign on and then potentially do something quite interesting. For some people, it was being in a band and getting into it and then just thinking, God, we can do this a little bit more and at least get the first single, get a John Peel session, get an album, do the tour around the art centres, and the second, possibly the third, before the friction of the band blew them apart. But it left this fantastic legacy of amazing music, didn't it? So yeehaw.
Yeah, I think you're quite right as well about those sort of economic conditions. Actually, things like the job seekers allowance did enable a certain level of that across, well, all areas actually, across the arts. Music, but not just music, but comedy as well. I've been on tour with Henry Normal, and he was telling me about the various kind of scenes that would emerge through the 80s. People not quite knowing how they're going to eke out a kind of living out of this, but they had a little bit of money coming in, and they they give themselves a year or a couple of years to give it a go and see whether they could make it. And
yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure that the decades that followed there was still quite those sort of unique set of circumstances.
No, and but then as that sort of period, we straddle. I mean, the Smiths break up, which I think is a massive moment, and then the ecstasy world comes along. So there's that dance scene, and the next wave of 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds want to sort of discover their new, their bands and their scene. And then you had the Seattle grunge scene. So when you went off to university, did you also find yourself changing as well a little bit and adopting a bit of a different personality as you escaped from Birmingham?
Well, I think I wouldn't say necessarily a different personality, but I think by that stage I'd really discovered the kind of music that I'd liked, and also I was in a position then to actually go out and see bands, and that's when I really started getting into bands like The Fall and The Wedding Present and the Cocteau Twins and Galaxy 500 and Blue Aeroplanes. I kind of went to see all of these bands around that time. Pixies, Teenage Fan Club, and Family Cat was a particularly wonderful gig I remember at uni. So I kind of immersed myself in that world, and I sort of just got into that world really, and indeed the world of Sarah Records and Heavenly and the Field Mice and the Orchids, and then at the same time as I was kind of immersing myself in all of that, that's when sort of rave started to get big. And I remember there was like I think it might have even been that Family Cat gig. I think I was kind of planning to go see Family Cat, and somebody said, there's a rave going on just up the road. Do you fancy coming along to that? And it's like, I'm going there now. And it was like a crossroads really, for that evening. Do I go and see the Family Cat?
God, it's like a Jim Jarmusch movie, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly, and I didn't really know much about the kind of rave business at that time. I thought, no, I'm going to go and see the band, and that's what I did. And I, so then I spent the next few years actually almost deliberately ignoring that whole rave culture. It wasn't for me. Again, I think I like music for music's sake, but again, there's something that really the place in my heart belongs to. Songs and lyrics and words and all of that, and and also I've always been shit at dancing, so I sort of didn't really go down that rave route at all. Didn't feel like it had anything for me. There's some bands that kind of crossed over that I was quite liked at the time. I wasn't immune to some of that sort of Manchester kind of scene, but all the same, I kind of felt like that was not really me. So I kind of I had plenty of other stuff to go off and see and to look into, all these bands that I'd missed out on or hadn't really heard of. So I had plenty to be getting on with.
Yes, my God, there's quite a lot there, isn't there? Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And at that stage, was kind of romantic melancholia your go-to kind of emotional state at this point? You were talking about lyrics and sort of words and sentiment. Well, I put the word sentiment in your speech there. You didn't use that word at all. But because I'm always drawn to sort of romantic melancholia, and I just think if you're into lyrics, there's a sort of a tendency to drift there rather than to go towards Wham, I suppose.
Yeah, no, yes, it certainly was my preferred choice then, and in fact always always has been, even now, despite the fact actually I'm probably most of the days I'm quite unromantic and I'm quite unmelancholic, but it's still I don't really know what to do with happy music. I don't really know how to react to it. It's like quite a lot of things in life, when I don't want to bring back to football again. It's about music, but I support Birmingham City, and they're in danger of becoming a good football team again. I don't know what I'll do about that. Maybe that's the day I'll stop supporting them, because
bring back Wayne Rooney. That's what we say, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. I'm far happier being unhappy.
He's like the Grim Reaper of football managers, isn't he, really?
Yeah,
just comes in and destroys any hope. So was Bob Latchford your main man at this stage, through the 70s? Was Bob...
Well,
or Trevor Francis?
Too young. I'm also too young for Trevor, sadly. The first time I saw him play was his first game against us. So I missed out on all of those 70s icons, unfortunately.
Yes, I followed football quite a bit in the 70s, but the 80s, the tight shorts and the hair and moustaches were just, it was just going to leave too much trauma in my life. And they don't. Did they ever have any success, Birmingham? I have no idea, actually. I remember Wolves were a bit sexier and they had some quite nice players and stuff, didn't they? But I couldn't remember, apart from the strip, which was that big white thing down the middle.
Oh, the Penguin strip, yeah, the classic. Yeah, no, they've never really had any success, despite being a very big club in some ways.
Do they still have a sexy chairman or woman? Is Karen with you, or has she left?
No, she left several decades ago now. But we've got a sexy chairman who's very charismatic American
he didn't make his money in porn magazines, or was that one of yours?
Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, that's right. It's as if you're not content to allow me just to remember all the misery of the trophyless years. You would have bring up the sleaze that was connected to it all too.
Well, yes, what paid the players' wages are sort of, God, that's terrible. Anyway, so at that stage, had you started to sort of find yourself occasionally going towards any poets, because we grew up with the angry poets, which I don't know if we liked them, but we kind of nodded along to Attila the Stockbroker and obviously John Cooper Clarke and Jules and various other people who, the Tube used to have an angry poet, didn't they? He'd come on and he'd rant and we'd go, oh my God.
Is it Mark Me Words? Is it Mark Me Words?
God, I don't know, but yeah, I just remember one sort of a winter's day. God, that sounds like a Christa Berg song. Watching some clips of the Tube on YouTube, and there was this suddenly all coming, those moments coming back of, God, the randomness was brilliant on that program. But there was an angry poet who would come in and shout at people or shout at the camera. So had you at that stage, thought, right, I need to. I don't know. When you're a bit younger, there is a sort of slightly, I must try and become more sophisticated and cool and watch French films and try and, I don't know, be seen to be liking Jack Kerouac and Hunter S. Thompson and the work of Tom Wolfe and talking about those things and Betty Blue and, all those kind of Jim Jarmusch films like, Stranger Than Paradise. Did you start sort of embrace some poetry at that point, or...?
Well, I had a bit of a sort of love-hate relationship with poetry in my teenage years. I mean, I think most of the poetry I was getting uh, was through pop music essentially. But then I did English A level, and we studied Larkin, did Philip Larkin, and he was probably the first poet that I responded to in some way, because I liked his mixture of kind of bleakness and humour, which was a kind of helpful thing for
Was that the
nineteen eighties.
Was that the Whitson weddings?
Whitson Weddings collection, yeah,
And
yeah.
then
It
the
also had
famous one.
swearing in it too, so that was always very exciting.
Oh, because I know the one about the parents and the, mess you up and f you up, and they add a few problems just for you or something like that. That
Yeah,
poem.
yeah.
Yes,
Just
but I couldn't remember
yeah.
where that sort of fits in his kind of.
Yeah, actually, I'm trying to think. I don't think it was in that collection. I think it's in a different collection. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the Whitson Weddings was just, yeah, that was a quite a big influence at the time in me understanding that poetry could be about the everyday, and it could be, um, you could. There was this sort of blend of being miserable but being funny about it, that I hadn't really. I suppose actually with Morrissey, I kind of tapped into it with him, and I found that in Larkin too. So that was the first time that I kind of really thought that poetry might have something in it. And then, of course, the other person I then discovered, who was short on misery but was very deep and high on humour and joy and laughter, was John Hegley,
Right.
who was a big influence. He was the first. It was the first time that I'd actually went into a bookshop and bought a book of poetry. I think I'd seen him on the telly doing one or two things, and I ended up browsing one of his books in a bookshop. And I thought it was just the most wonderful thing. Someone having so much fun with words, was being kind of silly, was being not, well, I guess irreverent in some kind of ways. Irreverence, showing an irreverence towards poetry and what poetry was supposed to be. I loved it. I didn't know you could write poems like that, and that people would like it.
Yes, that's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting you mentioned, I know there's the great debate with poets about, songs aren't poet. I remember when David Bowie died, there was a terrible kind of interview with some poet who really made a point of pointing out that his lyrics weren't poetry. And that might be true, but it was the night he died. I thought there's no point starting to get quite sort of so particular and annoyed about this. Let it go. Just on tonight, of one night. Just don't go on about it. But Bob Morrissey was what was always interesting, because I always felt that he, on one level, acted all hurt, but then you realise towards the end of every song, or the last line, he would twist it as if to say, yeah, like rejection is one thing, but rejection from a fool is cruel. It was that kind of, he always somehow acted like the victim, but somehow would just twist it. And then you realise that actually he was happy in his little world, which at the time we thought was a lovely little world, but no, I'm not quite sure. It's Morrissey's an interesting one to deal with, because he meant so much. And
no, I feel at this stage, in case we don't ever get to talk about it later, it's quite difficult now to actually. I can still listen to the Smiths, but I find Morrissey as a person hugely problematic, and feel slightly betrayed by him. But anyway, I feel like I need to get that down on record right now, in case I don't get another chance to say in the course of the interview. Because I didn't sign up for the worldview that he went on later to espouse. Put it that way.
No, but I sort of had to had a lot of processing with Morrissey just on my own, not probably with the cat, more than having to go to a therapist about Morrissey. And I suppose I looked at it as an example of what can happen if you're not careful as you get old, and bitter. And there's enough people from the 60s who are quite right-wing or like, oh, that's so disappointing. I was hoping that you would have turned out to be a kind of a groovy, nice person who was nice, but instead you're a bit like Roger Daltrey or Johnny Lydon or these characters. And I suppose I look at it as just make a note to myself not to end up in that situation, being so I look at it, I suppose that's how I think, okay, you can start being vegetarian, promote an eco-over on the front of the NME virtually and being so beautiful. And I watched those early interviews with him and I just think that's so gorgeous. And, you were so different and so radical. Everything you said must have been so challenging to the mainstream. And, daytime Radio 1 absolutely hated him. I mean, Steve Wright, was appalled by the whole Morrissey and they all were, Simon Bates and Bruno Brooks and people. But, and he sort of was able to cope with that. But then just to see this kind of path and think, oh my God. So I suppose, like I said, I'm a massive David Bowie fan, and almost that's a bit easy because he almost doesn't put much wrong, and he just gets better and better with Bowie. And I think, but that can make life too easy. Whereas Morrissey is a little bit more complex because can you listen to the Smiths still? Can you still enjoy those lyrics and then see what happens next? So I think it is quite useful. That's my theory.
Yeah, and this stuff is difficult. I mean, I was talking about that. Larkin was one of the people that got me into poetry. And a huge fan of Thatcher. You read his diaries, and it's got some abhorrent kind of views in there. There's a lot of racist kind of stuff in there.
Did he have some sort of Nazi thing in his room or something? I don't. Was it Larkin?
I can't remember. Yeah,
some swastika bedspread or something.
It wouldn't entirely surprise me. And I think also when I look at the Whitsun weddings from a slightly kind of different view, you can and actually kind of knowing what I know about him now, you can reinterpret some of what he's written in a slightly different way too. And actually, there's some of it that is a little bit sneering at the working class people that I didn't necessarily kind of pick up on at the time of reading it. And I get the same thing a little bit with Morrissey. I mean, not really with those early Smiths albums, but after a while you start to kind of it's like being a detective, isn't it? You start to kind of, if only there was a clue there on that that line of that song. If only I'd have connected that with the next one, I would have cottoned on to a lot earlier. But you don't. You're often blinded, aren't you, by your love of the music and the love of everything else that they've done.
And there was I think, and like you said, if you looked at all the artists and throughout the centuries and decades, etc., it kind of, this is amazing. Then you go, oh God, their personal life's not good, is it? It's not. No, that's
you wouldn't be able to listen to or to listen
painters.
To people or watch anyone exactly.
So once you left university, obviously at this stage you were going into some form of career. So was this publishing that you went into at this stage?
Yeah, that's right. I moved to London and got into publishing. It's called academic publishing, and I ended up doing that for several decades, really. And music was always ticking along in the background. I should say as well, I was in kind of some in bands as well myself. In those kind of teenage years and early 20s, playing, either covers or we'd write our own stuff. When I was at uni, we were in a band called Mad Cow, who were billed once as Swansea's answer to the Happy Mondays, and partly because most of the band were completely off their head for most of the time. And we'd also be joined on stage by a kind of super fan who was called Stan, who would turn up at every gig. He used to arrive at the gig in normal clothes, but with a kind of plastic carrier bag with him. And then just before we went on, he'd disappear off to the loos, and he'd emerge out of the toilets wearing a kind of like a leotard and a kind of flowery bathing cap,
Right.
maracas, and he would join us on. He was about 6'6", and he would join us on stage and then sort of dance away to us, and then he'd disappear again at the end of the night. It was a beautiful thing.
Yes, absolutely. I suppose at that point you had the Bez, and also the Flowered Up also had their dancing.
Oh yeah.
So I guess it was a bit of a theme there, wasn't there? And I think they even was it Nirvana had. I think at the Reading one they had a fan who would come on and.
Oh yeah.
I don't know.
Well, the Airplanes had a dancer too. Or indeed, he still dances with them.
Oh my God! So I suppose you can't really do much with a dancer if they sort of just want to do it. I guess he would.
No, we liked it. He was a sort of. He ended up being a sort of unofficial part of the band. In fact, I think more people came to see him in the end than they did to see us. But that was okay.
Did you ever get into the studio and manage to record anything, or were you just a live band?
We were just a live band. Yeah. Yeah, I was in a school band too before that. But we were doing mainly jam covers. Actually, we managed to get our first ever gig was in the school hall in 1986, and we did about 4 jam songs, and I think we did a cover of Happy Hour, which might even have been in the charts at that stage. But we got all that down on tape. My brother was there with a 4-track Porter studio recording us our very first kind of gig. And and that was fun. And the rest of the band, they went off to do music kind of professionally for a number of years as well. So
right, my God. Yeah. So did you say after that you then went into a few other musical combos at this stage in the 90s? And
well, no, not really, because by the time I got to London, I got this job ended up working in publishing, and then actually not long after, started to kind of we had a family, and then for a number of years it was hard to do anything at all music related other than listening to some CDs at home. But all the gig going sort of took a back seat for a while. Yeah, yes, certainly playing in a band too. Yeah.
Yes, well, work 5 days a week and all that malarkey does take all the time then. And then sort of that was the 90s and the years. So then the teen period, I don't know what they call that now. So were you still working? When were you starting to feel that creative moment to start writing poetry?
Well, that all happened when I joined Twitter, which I think was probably now. I don't know, 2011 or something like that, maybe. So 14 years ago or so, and I'd always written some poetry, but it was generally just for my own use. It was often quite a lot of sort of, passive aggressive tirades against people. For instance, I would go off on some sort of sales conference with work, and I'd endure a night accompanied by senior managers. I'd go back to my hotel room and I'd sort of write a sort of kind of poem about these people I've been hanging out with, just as a way of getting through the whole week. And so I used to do quite a bit of that and other bits and pieces in writing. But it wasn't until I joined Twitter, and I've been on Twitter for a year or so actually, before I'd actually started to post out some of the poems that I've been writing. And it wasn't really. I didn't necessarily even see it as like a creative, like, urge that I had necessarily. I was just having a bit of fun in my spare time, trying to make a few people laugh, and I had no idea it would come to this.
Yes, and then obviously you developed a voice, a style, a way. Did it take a while to get that to get to that point, from being angry at your sales managers and team meetings to then sort of finding something that felt a lot more comfortable than just some form of anger management?
Well, I guess I call them angry, but they were humorous more than anything. I think, and they were just sometimes just a way of taking any kind of frustration you have out of you. So it wasn't too much of a. I don't think my voice was particularly different, to be honest, when I started on Twitter. I think there's a degree of there was a degree of cynicism that I carried over with me when doing this. A degree of being kind of miserable, but also a degree of actually at the heart of it all, wanting to write things that, well, either would make me laugh, well, hopefully would make me laugh, and then if they made me laugh, maybe they might make other people do the same. So that was quite a natural transition in some ways. But like I say, I hadn't really anticipated kind of going in this direction at all. Really, I was just having a bit of fun. It was a pastime, really, more than anything else. It was something I did in my lunch hours.
Yes, blimey. I'd slightly forgotten, but when I did a cultural studies degree, and we had George Surtees as our teacher, and I do remember
yeah.
we would sort of have to do a bit of poetry with George, actually. And I remember
he's fabulous.
Yes, he is. But I just remember he seemed to give me a better mark if it was a much shorter poem, really.
Yeah.
So it was a bit weird. It was like you'd write these, and then he would just slam them, just and then you were right. I'll make it very short and snappy and much more just like, whimsical. And he seemed to enjoy that, dear old George.
Yeah, and also that was the great thing about sharing those poems on Twitter. When I joined, the poems I was writing were 140 characters or less. You couldn't, in that environment, you couldn't really have any word that was superfluous.
Yes. And I guess with that, it gives you a discipline of not just of like, right, a bit like doing Word or something like that, doing something nearly every day, but actually putting it out there as well, rather than just putting it in your, bottom drawer or sort of having it in your diaries and never being published. I guess, did that help being on Twitter at that stage and knowing that you were building this little audience?
Well, in some ways it was easier. I mean, it was kind of easy at first to do this because and actually I kind of do miss these days even now, because when I was first sharing poems, there were only about 16 people that followed me, and the chances of any of them actually ever encountering anything that I'd written was quite slim, because they probably just scrolled past it, and so that was great, because it kind of it felt like I was purely doing it for myself, and didn't matter what anyone else thought, didn't matter whether it was kind of looked at or kind of read, and then. It was only when a few of the poems then actually did manage to kind of take off, and the following grew, then all of a sudden you kind of think, oh, this is now, this is a different business for me now, because people will actually see this. I do actually have to. I can't just toss one off in my lunch hour, as it were. Is a Twitter-based kind of innuendo, but I have to kind of think about this, and I have to write something that is good,
yes.
and so all of a sudden there's this sort of pressure that was on me that I didn't anticipate, and so over the years it's become harder as a consequence to write in some ways, because if you're just writing simply for yourself, or knowing that nobody else is really going to read it, then it's purely the act of writing that you carry with you. You don't have the other stuff that comes, and I do miss that.
Yes, well, I guess there is the pressure. I mean, you could be going through that bit like Bowie in the 80s, that kind of period where you think this isn't quite it, David. You're going to have to go back to it. And do you use different techniques for writing? Do you ever get into different, not states of using drugs, but do you sort of play with ideas or stuff like that? I suppose thinking of cut-ups, but I guess it's not going to work like that at all, is it, really?
Well, I do. I mean, in terms of ideas, then I have all sorts of different stimuli, I guess, which can range from actually, making sure that I'm out and about in the world and doing things. I'm not just sat at a desk all day. I'm absorbing things, and sometimes you might hear a kind of snippet of something over here, someone snippet of someone's conversation. You think, well, that's an interesting word or phrase or thing they're talking about, and you get this sort of German of an idea for a poem. But other times, it's quite helpful to have a more of a kind of formal prompting. So one of the things that's quite helpful to me, actually, it was quite helpful when I was writing a lot of poems on Twitter, was like hashtags, and you'd see that today was Penguin Awareness Day, and you thought, all right, okay, today I'm going to write a poem about being aware of penguins, and that's so you'd have these kind of starting points, which can be quite helpful. I think probably the least helpful thing is just literally sitting at your desk and staring out the window. But then within that, I think because I was writing on social media, and I quickly, I guess, kind of worked out that the environment that I was working in was a very visual one. I did think quite hard about how my poems looked on the page too. So I ended up kind of writing poems in the form of Venn diagrams and Excel spreadsheets, and I guess because I was working in an office too, PowerPoint presentations, all sort of org charts, those kind of things, because not only did they often usually kind of reflect the kind of thing I was writing about, but it was a way of, I guess, the poems maybe standing out a little bit more in this world surrounded by images and videos.
Yes, it's interesting. I was really obsessed with the photographer Martin Parr, and I remember thinking, God, those early pictures that he took, or he must have just had to spend so many hours just wandering around streets, crowds, just to find that moment. But how do you keep that kind of ability to be, a bit like a small little indie band? Those first couple of albums can just be so brilliant. But, that was when they were not living on the streets, but they had that thing to to sort of relate to or sing to, or the audience certainly could relate to their life as well. And I remember the first few Eddie Izzard concerts, he would have sketches about the new queue at the supermarket. But then when you become famous, you probably aren't rich. You probably don't need to go and worry about that new queue at the supermarket. And how do you then write your sketches that are going to be relevant to the everyday people?
Well, the good thing about going into poetry, though, of course, is that chances are you're not going to get rich. So you're not going to find yourself in a particularly kind of different socio-economic status. In fact, probably in my case, having kind of worked at relatively kind of senior level for a publishing company, it's the other way around completely. And going into poetry is just a midlife kind of crisis, essentially. But at the same time, I'm kind of aware that I don't want to write too many poems about being a poet either, because that gets a little bit boring too in its own way. So you have to try and somehow put that to one side if you're kind of when you're writing, because if not, it just becomes a bit of an in-joke, doesn't it, to other poets?
Yes, and to us, we can't relate to it that much, even though I did have a class with George Surtees many years ago. So then when you bought your first book, you took The Last Bus Home. This was it, wasn't it? The collection of your early work. At that stage, did you think that was it? That was going to be your piece and you were still keeping the day job?
Well, yeah, so that book happened again. I didn't go out. It sort of happened to me, and I hadn't even sought to get any of my stuff published, but somebody had approached me, and it just happened. But it also happened at a time where I was getting a bit disillusioned with working in an office and working in the publishing industry. So although I then I ended up taking another job within publishing, but I think I'd always had my eye on whether I might be able to kind of take the poetry further in some way. At this stage, I've got an agent as well, And she was very good in that she encouraged me to be ambitious and encouraged me to think beyond poetry. And I mean, not least, helps her, doesn't it, if she's got something more valuable to sell. And so she encouraged me to go into fiction. So I ended up kind of writing then this sort of a novel which had poems in it, like a diary with poems in it. And I was lucky enough for that to get shortlisted for the Costa Award. And I think it was around then I kind of thought, well, right, okay, you can do this as a career. It might be a bit of a slog, but you've got enough things going on that this could be a new direction for me. So yeah, I mean, it took me quite some time to figure that out, and even actually after having kind of then become a full-time poet for a number of years, I even then for a while picked up a part-time job back in a library. Partly because it was nice to have some money coming in on a regular basis, even if it was pennies. But also for that reason I mentioned earlier, it was good not to be sat at my desk all day, to actually go out and do other things and interact with people during the day or during the evenings, because I needed that kind of stimulus to be able to write. And up until that point, I'd always... the writing had to fit in amongst all the other things I was doing. And in some ways, when I got a chance to write, I'd really make the most of it. But when your whole day stretches in front of you, day in, day out, then you have to have these strategies, I think, to...
Yes, you are going to be all work and no play, won't you? Jack Nicholson here, The Shining's going to...
Yeah.
It's not good. So your novel, the Diary of a Somebody, which was... And this was it just came out before the dreaded lockdown period, didn't it? So how did you then navigate that enthusiasm we had for a new decade, thinking it was all going to be exciting, and then it slightly sort of all got hit paused within three months of 2020?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess on the sort of personal level, I mean, I found it quite tough, certainly those first kind of 6 months, like a lot of people. And I think probably though professionally, quite a lot of good came out of those years for me, because I did a lot of writing, and I was writing about the things going on around me, and the madness of various government actions and all of that stuff. And even now, when I'm out and about and I do poetry gigs, I get quite a lot of people who come up to me and say, I first encountered you during lockdown. It was your poems that were making me laugh, and it was like a grim time. And so, although even at that stage I had a couple of, maybe 2 books out, I think. I think probably those COVID years, I was doing a lot of writing, and I think I ended up getting quite a lot of attention through that. Even though now I'm saying it, I feel quite awkward for having kind of said that, as if as if I took advantage of the fact that tens of thousands of people were dying. But it was a strange time, and I felt that sense of dislocation and the kind of weirdness, and I think that probably struck a chord with the poems that I was putting out with from other people who were reading them.
Yes, well, it was kind of there was some surreal moments, wasn't there? Sort of trying to have not arguments, but conversations about whose bubble are you in, and trying to explain to one's parents about your bubble. And well, you can't be in. No, mum, that's not right. Okay, don't worry about it. I'm sure neither of us have got it, so we're going to be fine. But that's not like the government. It was all rather peculiar, and the excitement of finding you got your appointment to have your jab and stuff like that was another. It was just the highlight of our year almost. But then the frightening thing of going to get this thing. So for some artists I did interview, they'd worked on the album, they had the tour, tour, and then it was like, boom. So God knows how they've coped. But other people had done the album, the tour, and were thinking, right, this is a year old, and have to recover and write the next one. And it was just who was lucky. That was like a lottery thing, basically. So
yeah, and you also get those people who they found it difficult because they really want to be out there. They want to be out there on the stage doing their thing, and they struggle when they don't have that kind of outlet for it. And even though I do these days, I do, kind of poetry gigs. They're a bit of a surprise to me still. I never really had that kind of urge to entertain the way that some people have. So I was generally okay, sat there at home writing my poems and just putting them out on social media.
And just rewinding back to the John Major years and New Labour and Team Tony in the 90s, I mean, there was this suddenly moment of excitement when it was Murray Lachlan Young, the £1 million poet, suddenly appeared. And I remember seeing him live a few times, supporting people like My Life Story and elsewhere. I mean, and his poems are very accessible. Did you also sort of become aware of that moment, the Champagne 90s period, champagne and cocaine period of and he had a fantastic stage presence and persona at that point.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It was I was vaguely aware of him, but I guess I was still I still wasn't properly immersed in the world of poetry at that stage. And despite the fact he crossed over to that kind of mainstream, he was just a news story for me. I didn't really know particularly what he did. I was never really going to like poetry gigs or anything like that, so I'd never seen him perform live. But I knew of him and what he was doing, and it was a slightly kind of puzzling moment. I mean, I think I'd moved on. Well, I was still really into my John Hegley at that stage, but I discovered other poets too, like Roger McGough, those kind of Liverpool poets, and indeed John Clarke I came to quite late. So I discovered some of these other people that I was reading, but poetry was just there during those years to me. It was just sort of in the background, really. I wasn't probably seeking it out in any way.
Because it was probably about 20 years ago now. There was this, and they're probably still happening, but I went to a few of these slam poetry events where, angry people like Luke Wright was there slamming it. And I remember thinking, that was quite exhausting, actually. Were you drawn to that world of, mostly men sort of slamming it down?
No, I've never been a slammer. Never been a slammer. I wouldn't know where to.
Is that like the dark web, or I don't know?
Well, no, not at all. I can see. I mean, I do see the appeal for people, and I have been to see Luke Wright in recent years, and I love him. He's a brilliant poet, very very kind of clever and powerful and funny, and he's kind of moved on from there. But I can, there's still a very healthy kind of spoken word scene that is out there, and it's all part of that poetry universe, really. And it's not quite where I would see kind of my home. And I don't know. I feel like I exist somewhere in this sort of maybe slightly weird space in the middle between the poetry slams on one end and then the sort of more kind of serious poems only on a page side at the other end, and I'm sort of occupying some space there in the middle.
Was it Tony? I remember sort of going to see Tony Harrison many years ago, and he wrote these colossal pieces that, I remember Stuart Lee once saying, those moments a bit like people who come to see me live, I think I should go and see Stuart. It's a bit like being Stuart Lee live. It's a bit like being on holiday and you're trying to have a nice time and someone, there is a Holocaust museum. We should see it. It's not going to be fun, but we should go. And it was, and so, sometimes in that period of my life, you think, I should go and see it. It might make me feel a bit more like more of an interesting person. It will make me feel more sophisticated. I had no idea what he was saying. And the only thing I remember was that he was called Tony Harrison or Anthony. Yes, he called himself Tony, but he said but the Times would always refer to him as Anthony because they needed to raise the standard a bit, which made me chuckle in the audience. But then he's read his poems, and I thought, I had no idea, but it seemed very worthy, and it's probably made me a better person. So,
well, yes. Well, I mean, actually, I do like Tony Harrison and his work. But you're right. There is also that kind of thing where you feel you might be improved by reading a poem that you don't understand, and I've always been slightly kind of wary of that, and I do have a kind of love-hate relationship with poetry, and I think it's all right as well not to understand a poem but still like it. I think that's still valid, in a way that sometimes you might do that with a song, so you might either not understand the words but you still like the song, or you might not understand why it is that you actually like a piece of music. You like the kind of sounds that are coming out, but there's something about it that you are responding to at some level. I don't think you need to get something in its entirety to be able to enjoy it.
Yes.
But then you've got to be, at the same time. I read a lot of poetry that I'm told is very, very good by other people, that it just doesn't do anything for me. And but I'm a firm believer there's either a poet or at least a poem or two for everyone out there. You may not realise it, but there will be.
Yes, well, absolutely. Which then leads us to this project that you've got, and album that has just landed this year with the Catenary Wires, Amelia and Rob. So how did this project come together?
Yeah, well, it had its sort of genesis in that I was spotted reading poems in a Heavenly T-shirt. And Hugh.
Was this an original Heavenly T-shirt?
It was no. I think I did have an original Heavenly T-shirt, but I think it might have disintegrated along with my Sarah Records T-shirt I used to have. But I did get it. I guess, I don't know, about 5 years ago, maybe.
Right.
4 or 5 years ago, and
a lockdown purchase.
Yeah, possibly. And in the audience, I was at the Larne Festival in Carmarthenshire, and Hugh from Swansea Sounds, Rob and Amelia's
and the Pooh Sticks
other band. Yeah, Hugh was in the audience, and I didn't know that it was Hugh from the Pooh Sticks, and he said, "Oh, I know Rob and Amelia. I'm going to let them know that you were wearing a T-shirt." And that's how we got in touch with each other. And then we sort of got chatting and kind of met up, and we all got on really well. And Rob suggested that we might want to think about working with each other. I didn't really know what he meant by that, to be honest. But in the end, I'm sure Rob did either, particularly. And in the end, we concluded that maybe a starting point was me to read a few poems and to send them him as audio files, and he would have a think about them and possibly have a go at turning one or two of them into songs in some way. And so that's how it got going. I sent off maybe 5 or 6 poems, and literally just a normal reading of a poem, and then a few weeks later, I start getting them coming back at me. And kind of Rob had sort of interpreted them in some way, and then we'd have a kind of back and forth about what we thought about it all. And so that's how we kind of got going. And I guess we kind of thought, well, we've got enough. After a while, we kind of thought, well, we could get enough for an album here, and so that was the kind of process, and it was well, amazing in many ways, not least that I think Rob was so good at understanding the right mood and the tone of the poems, So often that what came back was what I hope what I would have hoped it to be, because it was quite nerve-wracking, because being such a fan of Rob and Amelia and in their various incarnations over the years, I was a little bit worried that what if I don't like what they've done. What if it's awful? And how would that conversation go? And but fortunately, I never had any of those thoughts. There were one or two songs where we had quite a lot of back and forth, because it might not have been the right poem, or it might just there's something about it wasn't quite working. But generally, I was amazed at how incisive and thoughtful Rob had been in terms of the kind of music that would fit the poem. Like, a great example of that is the first one on the album, Alexa, What Is There to Know About Love, which often gets quite a few laughs when I read it out loud, and people think it's just about kind of technology, but actually it's about being kind of alienated. It's about kind of loneliness, essentially. It's quite a sad, quite miserable poem, and he completely captured that with the arrangement. And I think others may not have seen that in that poem in that way.
Yes.
So so the whole thing has been a wonder to me, really. In the same way that I didn't think I would ever have a book published, or I'd make a career as a poet. I never thought I'd have an album out either. It's just like, it's weird things are happening to me. I don't know what's been going on with the universe, but strange things keep happening to me that I've not sought out, but dearly, dearly cherish.
Yes, well, God, it's amazing. I do. I mean, it did strike me that the whole. I mean, every track on it is just brilliant, and obviously there's a lot that one of a certain generation can remember, and sort of smile and cringe and process, which is Compilation Cassette, which was one of the most kind of time-consuming but so emotionally charged things that one ever did when you fell in love, or thought you were falling in love, and you were hoping this was going to be the one, even though the person you might have never hardly spoke to, and you put this cassette together, tape, and it just took forever. And you wanted to play certain songs, but then you wanted to also have certain songs that were going to suggest certain motives. That they never played the thing, but and that some really tricky, because again, you just want to be a bit pretentious, so you might put a Miles Davis track on there alongside some sort of rather jaunty Genesis song, from the Phil Collins period, which is a disaster, I know. But you want to be, you want a few sort of, you don't want it to be too, you don't want Psychic TV or Throbbing Gristle, do you? You need it to be, it needs to say so much. But
that's where I was going wrong. Yeah.
Yes, it's a brilliant, just an absolutely brilliant idea. And when you did that poem, you must have. Was it fun to write it?
Well, it's funny that poem was in my very first book. So it's one of my oldest poems now, I guess, and I can't really remember writing it. Like a lot of those earlier poems, because it was just me having some fun, probably not thinking there's any audience for this whatsoever. So I can't really remember, but now I've kind of heard that. Now it's sort of, I've sort of dug that poem up, and it's become a song. It has kind of brought it all back to me. Actually, how much time I did spend in kind of crafting those cassettes, and actually with so little sort of reward.
Yes. The hours and the effort. And then another one which was beautiful was She Danced as well. That's another classic. When did this one come about?
I think that was around lockdown time, actually. And I'd had sometimes you just start with a phrase and it takes you somewhere. And I think that sort of cliched phrase about dancing like no one is watching. Is that even from a song? I think it probably is, isn't it, originally? But there's something about that I thought could have an additional significance. And actually, I thought about people that I've known, and I think I was also thinking about people in lockdown too, who'd lost someone dear to them, and particularly when you're at a certain, kind of a certain age, and you've brought up a family, and you're not living on your and you're living on your own. You're remembering that person and the thing that dancing and music can give to a person. So that all kind of came together, and I remember actually sharing that poem during lockdown, and it a lot of people said how it kind of resonated with them. So I was again really amazed at the job that Rob did in terms of the music that he put to those words, because it's perfect. It just kind of captures um, just catches those words so perfectly.
Yes, and the other one, every song reminds me of you. When was this one written?
Well, again, actually, that's another one that was in my first book, but like a number of the poems, I did a lot of rewriting of them. So I like the idea or the conceit of something, but then I'll have a think about, well, how would that work if it was in a pop song, for instance. For instance, would you need a chorus, or how would a verse kind of go? Because I like the, because it's such a trope, isn't it, of films and TV series that that if someone's kind of broken up with their partner, and they switch on the radio, and it feels like the song that's coming out is talking about their kind of split up, or about their split and their breakup. And so I thought, well, what happens if you take that to an extreme? What actually if the songs, which with all their disparate lyrics, were actually just about one single person? What kind of a person would that be? And probably quite a weird person. And so I just had a bit of fun with that one, thinking about what are the kind of professions that come up in songs, and how are the various ways that eyes get described in songs, and maybe they could all belong to the same person in a slightly sort of ironic way that also celebrates, I guess, the power of radio and the power of music to move us in ways that we don't always know.
Yes, well, absolutely. And then the two, which is 31 Rules for Midlife Rebellion and As I Grow Old, I Will Not Shuffle. Are they more recent poems, those two?
Um, they're still quite a few years old, I would say. I've got a fondness for list poems. So the 31 Rules is one of those. Always have good fun compiling a poem out of a list or two. Um, the the I Will March Not Shuffle poem. I think that came up um, around some of the protesting that was going on up and down the country to Johnson and all of that. So again, it's a few years old.
Yes, it's interesting because a few weeks ago I did an interview with David Haskins, David J from Bauhaus, and he's just brought out an album of poems, and it is, I mean, one's only 16 minutes long, and it's all about his kind of his relationship and his his mother and death. And I was just thinking how, I mean, it's absolutely, if you get a chance to hear it, it just is absolutely, it's emotionally incredible. It's he only managed to sort of complete it eventually. I think he wrote it decades ago, but only completed it when he eventually sort of buried the ashes. But again, it's just interesting sort of how artists are dealing with older age. I don't know if you heard the latest Cure album, but again, they're sort of singing in a way that you just think, I don't know, one song's about the death of his brother, and then this might be the last song, the last track on side two. And it's just going to be interesting how you capture also a similar feeling of the time, but also the aging process as well, that we're all having to slowly navigate as we enter different decades.
Yeah, well, I find it quite refreshing that there is more of that going on, because I think, feel like for a long time you'd end up, in the music world, you'd end up with bands with people in their 40s and 50s singing about the same kinds of things they were singing about when they were in their late teens and early 20s, and which is rather kind of disingenuous in some way, I think. And give me relatable content. I'm keen on that.
I did see Lloyd Cole a few years ago, and I think he was having difficulty performing some of those songs he wrote when he was younger, because obviously, one isn't up all night making mad love, but just shuffling to the toilet and thinking, God, is that the second time tonight? But it's hard to put that in a uplifting rock song, isn't it, really? ESI levels.
Yeah.
So yes. So then, I mean, I think it's brilliant. I do love it, and I think the music that goes with it and the delivery is brilliant. But then you had this great idea and saw it through, which is stunning. When did you decide to then take it on the road? Was this another one of those ones that just kind of happened as well?
Well, Rob had kind of mentioned it again, and again, it came from Rob, and I think at first I kind of, I sort of nodded, but in a sort of hesitant way, thinking I'm just too terrified to do this. And but I mean, we're still not at a stage where we've all the band's been in the same room together, having kind of played these songs. So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have our first kind of proper band rehearsals. And I'm someone, although I do poetry gigs, all my life I've been hiding from being center stage in any way. So for me it feels like quite a big thing. But also I think it's a big thing for all of us in the band, because we've been we could be playing in front of some relatively big audiences in like proper theatres, and so I'm very excited about it, but it is a bit unknown territory for us all. And we've actually got quite a few dates in November. We're gigging most nights. I've got no idea whether people are going to love it or hate it or whatever, but I think we're all determined to enjoy it anyway.
Yes, and with the evening, obviously it's billed as this. Will you be doing bits on your own as well as the band, or will you be just doing this with other songs that didn't make the album?
No, I think what we're going to do is we'll start with maybe a 20-minute set from the Catenary Wires, and they'll do some of their great back catalogue. I'll then do a 20-minute solo poetry set, and then we'll come on and play the album. We don't at the moment. There aren't songs that didn't make it onto the album, so we've got 13 songs in total. Whether we end up putting anything else to music before the tour, I don't know, but I think that's how we're going to do it. So it's going to be an evening of music and poetry, both on their own but also combined. So I think I think that sounds like quite a good night out.
That's a quality evening. And actually, You've got an amazing month, haven't you? Because you've got the First Light Festival on the solstice in Lowestoft, and then Glastonbury, and then Latitude. So that's in July. So yes, a lot of performing. And have you been enjoying being with Henry Normal, going around the country?
Yeah, no, I really have. And I toured with Henry last year for a few months, and then we had a more kind of intensive month, in which we had like 24 shows in the month of May. So it's quite full on, and but it's been brilliant. Henry's poetry's, I'm a big fan of Henry's poetry, and it sort of complements mine, I think, in many ways. And Henry's always a delight to travel around the country. He's always got so many stories about either his early years as a poet or his years working in TV, and he's just a sort of adorable human being as well. So
yes, and what sort of when you look at the audience, what's a typical kind of fan that you've got? Is there a type, or do they change from city to city?
Well, they're always a bit older than I think than they should be. They're usually older than me, and which is fine. Nothing against that. I'm not going to be ageist in any way, but it's always a bit of a surprise when I go on stage and think, "Oh, where have you all come from?" And but at the same time, then we do get teenagers and people in their 20s and 30s as too. So it's quite a broad audience. It depends where we are. So like our gig, we did a gig at the Hackney Empire last month, and the audience there was probably, well, it seems to be a lot younger. A lot of people there in their kind of 30s and 40s. And then when you go off and do a gig in where else? Lancaster, everyone there seems to be in their 50s and 60s and 70s, if not
Yes.
older. Yeah. So
Yeah.
quite where the music sits with that audience is an interesting question, and what the intersection of the kind of Venn diagram of Brian Bilston on one side and Catenary Wires and
Amelia
kind of
Fletcher.
indie music,
Yes.
how big that is in the middle, we don't quite understand.
Because you've got Sarah Records, Amelia's kind of illustrious. Her academic career is not going to have any impact on that, is it?
There's probably a bit of an overlap between the Brian Bilston audience and the UEA academic audience.
Well, I think is it to do with, is she an economist to do with monopolies and multinationals and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's right.
They can get really argy-bargy if you're not careful. Copies of The Guardian and smacking them against the New Statesman.
Yeah.
It can get quite messy. And then obviously everyone loves merchandise. And will you be selling T-shirts and other paraphernalia on this?
Oh, good question. Well, I think Rob's been thinking about that more than me, because I've always avoided the whole kind of merch thing when I've just been doing my poetry, other than having books there, of course. But I think T-shirts have been talked about. Mugs are in existence. I've not actually seen one yet, but there is a Brian Bilston and Catenary Wires mug. I don't know whether we're going down a tea towel route. Who knows? Who knows?
Christmas around the corner. I think this is all there. You've got to be planning this,
Yeah.
sort of, to think about the Christmas tree. So yeah, that could be quite nice actually.
Yeah.
And have you ever performed abroad, by the way?
No. So that's something that is being looked at, but probably not for any time soon.
Because I could imagine it would be very popular on the continent.
Yeah. No, we'd love to. We'd love to, I'm sure. But at the moment we're just going to try out this sort of mini UK tour, and then whether we do any more next year,
yes,
to be seen.
I wouldn't put any more things in your diary for November. It's pretty full, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, look, we'll see you in Norwich on the 3rd of November, which is very exciting, actually. I know friends have already bought tickets, so all good stuff. And yes, brilliant. Well, look, Brian, thank you ever so much. And I'll put this out. And yes, it'll be brilliant. But again, thanks for the album. It's been a real pleasure to play it and listen to it. So all good stuff.
Cheers, David.
And I hope you have a lovely time at Glastonbury Festival. It will be magic.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been to Glastonbury. I think 1989 or 1990, I think was the last time.
Oh wow! My first was 87, and then I was a bit addicted. But there is, if you ever get a chance, because you talked about the Blue Aeroplanes, well, mentioned them. But Rodney Allen, who was a solo singer. I think he's in the Blue Aeroplanes occasionally, or is. But he did a lovely song called Glastonbury. And if you listen to the lyrics, if you love lyrics, he talks about the cheese giving you bad dreams.
Yeah, I know that song. Yeah.
Yes, it's still one that I dig out at this time of year and smile. So good old Rodney. Anyway, look, I'll let you go on. But thanks a lot and have a lovely summer. Okay.
Cheers. Thank you. All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. You probably gathered that. But that's Brian Bilston, who has got live dates and also this incredible collaboration with the Catenary Wires and live dates that are going to be this coming November, starting on the 30th of October, basically. But then, from then on, right through to the 4th of December, he's going to be around the country with Amelia Fletcher and Rob Percy. Anyway, this is the C86 show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that stuff. And all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Have a great week. Stay safe.